Hello, my name is James Bundy and I'm the Director of Operations for Freedom Declared Foundation. Freedom Declared was set up to promote freedom of religion or belief within the United Kingdom. I am delighted to be joined tonight by John Patrick Mallon, the co-founder of Sancta Familia, one of the largest Catholic social media platforms in the United Kingdom, and they are based in the west of Scotland. Thank you for joining us tonight, John.
It's a pleasure because, James, the last time we spoke, I think, before on this kind of format was 2 years ago nearly now, at the very start of the coronavirus pandemic, and things were very uncertain. So I'm glad to see that you've come through that last 2 years. I'm still here as well. So it just shows you that life can and will go on.
Indeed, and things seemed a lot more optimistic now than they did those 2 years ago. So yes, onwards and upwards. And I'm glad that we can continue to have these conversations and hopefully in person soon. The first question that I ask everyone doing these interviews is, what is your definition of freedom of religion or belief?
Well, to me, it seems perfectly obvious is that you have the ability to practice your faith really without any interference from the state. You have the ability to pass on the teachings of that faith to your children and preach about that teachings in the community without any interference from the state either words. And we're seeing that might not entirely be the case in the United Kingdom and particularly Scotland today.
What examples do you have in mind where these things aren't being fulfilled?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things. One of our areas is we work in social media, and we're seeing increasingly now that a lot of the big tech companies, which are under the authority of the relevant states, are beginning to censor some very, very basic forms of Christian teaching, which has always been established teaching, and especially around the areas of sexuality. We're seeing it around the areas of abortion. And I think, that is something which is evident to me and has been evident to me increasingly over the pandemic as we've increased our use of bringing the faith online.
Do you have Sancta Familia ever had posts taken down?
Yeah, we have, yeah. A lot of the time, the particular social media companies don't give an exact response as to why it happened. Generally around the pro-life themes, we find that is limited. We have seen our Facebook shadow banned on occasion because of the pro-life content. We recently shared a video on TikTok, which was recorded a few years ago, 2 years ago, in fact, with a girl called Elena, who's a member of the Courage Network, which helps Catholics with same-sex attraction to live out their Catholic faith. And despite the fact there was nothing in that interview remotely controversial from societal or Catholic viewpoint, that was banned by TikTok, which we subsequently appealed, and that was then restored back to our TikTok page. So it does show you that there's rogue actors out there, whether or not these social media giants want to admit it or not. That you do see that there are certainly efforts being made to reduce the impact and the spread of basic Christian Catholic teaching.
Yes, and these teachings can be involved in part of the controversial debates that we are having in society, abortion, same-sex marriage, issues that have real contention and heated debate. How has the reaction by just people using the social media been to the content that you guys are producing?
Well, as you think you mentioned in your intro, we are one of the largest social media networks in the Catholic community in the United Kingdom, and that includes Ireland as well. So what we do see is that despite the fact we put out the fullness of the Catholic teaching on all these difficult subjects, as you would call them, these subjects which not everyone agrees with, and that includes Catholics, we see that they are generally well received. Some people, and a very small minority on our Facebook feeds and other places, do respond negatively. Generally as those who are Catholic and do not share the church's teaching on it. But we try and allow an open platform, a place for the exchange of ideas and debates within certain parameters which don't border onto abuse or threat or violence or intimidation. But the ability for people who do have opposing views to meet, and hopefully that will provide a space where they can learn and grow from each other in respect. And what undermines everything that we do is it's a love for our faith, but also love for human beings as well, because We believe in our faith. We believe that what our faith teaches, in particular, has something to offer the whole world and is good for everyone. So we offer those challenging topics, as you might call them, with that intention, which is to love everyone.
You mentioned there about trying to create this open platform for conversation, but there's a limit on threats and abuse. Have you, well, as a page, received threats or abuse?
Well, I would say the majority of our trouble, if you can call it that, comes from fellow Catholics, those who don't like the fact we share Orthodox Catholic views. They would rather see us shut down, and they appeal to hierarchical authorities such as bishops and other members of the clergy and beyond to try and shut us down. We had one instance as well with some political parties having some issues with some of our posts, which members of parties and representatives as well basically try to shut down some of the conversations we're having. People tend to think, that we are one day pro SNP, the next day pro Scottish Tory, which I don't see how that works. We're not pro any party. I know you have your own leanings yourself, but we're not pro any party per se in Scotland. We're pro policies which do fit in line with our faith, and we'll certainly oppose policies which no Catholics we feel should vote for. So we do find blowback from that, from individuals who have strong party allegiances, and that's understandable, but we have to stand firm.
Yes, and the teaching of the church is pretty clear that you don't put your eggs in one basket in terms of politics. You judge more on the policy and the individuals rather than the political party colours. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you mentioned some fight back from political parties. And I guess that leads to the question about what role do you think the state or the government has to play in online regulation, if they do have any role to play?
Well, quite obviously they do have a role to play in terms of, making sure there's no threat to the wider public from violence or intimidation. And yeah, you can clearly see there's a line drawn there. I don't think anyone can look at our posts or anything we've ever posted or anything the Catholic Church teaches which would imply or demonstrate beyond that line. There clearly is a line. I can't speak for other religions and groups, but from the Catholic point of view, I don't see that crossing any line there at all. We're called to love everyone with respect, treat everyone as brothers and sisters, as children of God, and that's the radical message of Christianity. Obviously the state has wider roles to play in other groups and other faiths, which I'm not familiar with their teaching fully, but it may cross some lines.
One thing that the Scottish government, the UK government as well, did during the pandemic was close places of worship in the name of public health. And what was your opinion on those closures?
Well, my opinion on those closures was varied. At the start, I certainly could see the merit when the pandemic was in its very early stages. We didn't know how this disease was spreading. There wasn't the strict hygiene measures in place. Very much we were kind of left the mercy of the virus without having, the implementation of PPE, the hygiene stations, all those sort of things. So my thinking was that, yeah, it might be a good idea for the churches to have that in place, and they needed that time perhaps to be closed. But on reflection from it as well, I don't think any government should have the right to close a public place of worship. And the subsequent closures, which have now thankfully been tested in court and proven to be unlawful, I think that shows more common sense that people who wish to go to church and practice their religion should be able to do so. And clearly, the churches are one of the safest places you can be, and more so now with the PPE in place. I'm not talking about packed venues. You look at, for example, Celtic Park, for example, a place where many Catholics will go. They sing, they're very tightly packed in stairwells and in their seating areas. And very often you hear of cases coming from there. You don't rarely hear of anyone in the church picking it up at church, who's contracted COVID over the last 2 years. So for me, I think it may have been an overreaction, but that's with hindsight. the benefit of hindsight is very good. But I think the right decision were made at the start, you know.
Yeah. Hindsight is very good, and yeah, the Court of Session judgment was very important on how the closure of places of worship will happen in the future. It must meet certain public health criteria before places of worship can close. In the second lockdown, where the Court of Session case was looking at, the Scottish Government did make provisions for juries, and you could go to the shop. There was some point that you could go to the cinema or a cafe, but you couldn't go to a place of worship. How were you feeling during those moments when you could see some places open, but your place of worship was still closed by the law?
Felt very unjust, you know. I felt in some way we were second-class citizens as Catholics, you know, because it was almost as if some arguments from some of the politicians were that you have online, you know. First of all, not everyone was online. You know, there were some parishioners who were left adrift throughout the whole time of the pandemic because they didn't have that facility in place. But secondly, they failed to understand there was a certain lack of literacy around how the Catholic faith works and how we interact with it. And we're a sacramental faith, you know, our faith is not just simply listening to something, you know, we can pray at home, but we participate in the sacraments. So to have the denial of or the access to that sacraments effectively by a government order was most disturbing to me. And that's why I was delighted to share on our pages this support Canon Tom White's legal campaign, which seemed to be a voice in the wilderness at that point in time for common sense.
Yes, and just now we have the situation where churches in Scotland, you must wear a face covering unless exempt, but you can go to the pub or restaurants, Celtic Park, without a face mask, despite them being probably more tightly packed and fluctuation of people. Do you think that's also unjust?
Well, I don't know if the Celtic Park analogy strongly stands up because certainly they do. I've not been to Celtic Park since or any other stadium. I think they do, in the back of my mind, suggest you wear masks, encourage that in the interior parts where they might say that the actual stands outside in the fresh air. So that might differ slightly from churches. I don't think, to be honest, that I have a major problem with mask wearing. It's become a symbol, in a sense, from the great divide of those who want greater freedoms and those who want greater protections, that the mask is a symbol of, it's almost like a badge of honor. Some people wear it with a badge of honor. I don't wear it as a symbol of something. I wear it because it makes sense. A lot of the masks don't work, actually. And I mean, homemade masks, other materials, there's evidence there that they're not very effective, whereas I choose to wear an FFP2, which is a medical grade one, which there are certainly some studies that suggest they are effective in, you know, the lowering the risk of transmission of the virus. But at the minute, you know, I would still keep that in place. I don't think it's too much to ask for. I suffer with asthma. I don't have any problem with my breathing. I think that's just, a lot of people use that as an excuse. And I don't mean to judge them in any way. It's not very, some people might find it very uncomfortable, but I think it's something we can hold on to, at least in the short term, for, you know, the prevention of cases. But it has to be a personal choice in the end, doesn't it? You know, when it comes to the, you know, the flu season and the cold season again, I mean, they might still be around. I don't see a major problem with that. I mean, I've not had as much colds the last 2 years than I've had before. It's a small price to pay.
Yeah, so that's interesting because there is a debate happening within the political world about the role of face masks. So it's interesting to hear that perspective, because some people do argue that it is infringement of freedom and therefore by definition extends to an infringement of freedom of religion or belief. So yeah, it was interesting to hear the perspective that you were just saying about that there is a common good to uphold as well, and when there's still uncertainty, that it might be for the common good to still wear face coverings in the church, the ones that work. When places of worship were closed, particularly during the second lockdown. You said that you felt unjust. Did you think it was an attack on your right for religious worship in public?
Whether I felt it was a attack on purpose is a different question, but yeah, it certainly hurt. It did. It felt, and I know many Catholics. I was speaking to many people, across the Catholic sphere in Scotland and beyond. Well, particularly in Scotland, they felt unjustly attacked for it. Whether, as I say previously, if it's back to that illiteracy of how the Catholic faith works compared to other faiths, then maybe so. But I just felt that there was an ignorance out there, that we were second-rate, second-class citizens.
So rather than being deliberate, it came from illiteracy.
I feel that way, yeah. I mean, I'm not privy to what the conversations are at, in private cabinet levels or with government advisors, but to me, it felt like they didn't have an understanding at all of how the Catholic faith worked or operated, and they made a broad brush, legislation on something they didn't know anything about.
And that's interesting, and that has come up in previous interviews about the lack of religious literacy within government, in the UK government as well, and how they responded to the pandemic and closing places of worship. So, if you could speak to the First Minister tomorrow, what would you tell her to increase religious literacy? What would you recommend are the best ways for government to become more literate in their religious, not views, but yeah, their knowledge of religions. That's the word I'm looking for. Knowledge about religions.
I'd question how often they do, elected politicians meet with Catholic representatives, and have. They may say they do, and they may claim they do at election time and go around and do the kind of tick a box. I got a photograph with a priest, or I visited Vincent de Paul or whatever, but when do they actually attend religious services? When do they talk to parishioners after mass, or when do they visit Catholic churches to see what exactly they're thinking? I haven't seen that in my life. Also, there are Catholic MSPs out there who do practice their faith, and they might disagree with that, but it's interesting. I don't feel represented. I'm not talking about someone who runs a Catholic media organization or speaking as a member of the church. I'm speaking as a lay Catholic, someone who lives locally. I don't feel like my representatives have any input to the Catholic faith in the town. I don't feel it, and I'm talking about MSPs and MPs,
So how you've obviously found it very difficult, but for anyone listening who wants their elected representatives to know the teachings of the Catholic Church or whatever faith that that the listeners have, and they say, no, I want my elected member to become more literate on this, on my faith. How should they go about doing that?
Yeah, as I said, they have to attend. They have to attend. They have to talk to clergy, to talk to the regular people in the pews about their experiences, and it just involves getting out more. And of course, that applies to every other religion as well, and in groups. But in particular, the Catholic faith has to be seen how it works, and what the sacraments mean to people. You can only hear that by talking to people who they may not consider important enough, or they may not consider worthy of talking to. I think back to the kind of, strong in my mind is that image of Gordon Brown talking to that woman talking about immigration. Again, a different topic, but the way he dismissed her that time as some bigoted woman, I kind of feel that the elected politicians nowadays have that kind of view that we're just some sort of old group of bigots who are going to die off. It's not worth engagement. I just feel that way. That's the way I feel. Do I have any statistics to back that up? Probably not. I don't know. Maybe you do, but it's just a feeling I have that they're treated almost as an anachronism, something which is outdated and is not worth engaging.
Do you think faith groups reach out to politicians enough for that engagement?
I think they do when it comes to the issues, whether or not the politicians group us in a box and say, well, okay, this is a certain hot topic issue. the faith teaches this on this issue, we'll just group it all in a box rather than individuals. I think that's the easy way out. I think, how do we welcome engagement from our politicians? Well, we use the vote more. A lot of the time, and I always try and do this with Sancta Familia, as a lot of the time in Scotland, people are very tribal when it comes to the politics, whether it's pro-union or whether it's pro-independence. And I don't necessarily think we should look at that way. I think we should look at the candidate as a whole person, and say, does this candidate or this option I'm voting select, does he represent or she represent the best outcome in light of my faith and what it represents? That's how I tend to vote, not along party lines. So there have been some interesting choices over the years for that.
Yeah. One thing that is also, I think, to take into account is that whilst we do have these concerns in the UK about closure of places of worship and regulation on social media, we are much better than many countries around the world when it comes to freedom of religion or belief. And Sancta Familia does post some horrific stories about religious persecution overseas. When you do share posts on those lines, what is the reaction like? Is it of shock, or is it of these things happen, as terrible as they are?
I think it's a sort of solidarity, you see, but I think in general, you will find that there's a varied response to where it happens. You know, the further away, it seems to be less closer to home, so to speak, than things that happen in Europe. You know, particular attacks on, I'm just thinking recently, the cases opening of Father Jacques Hamel in France, who was killed saying mass in 2016. That struck home because of the nature of how close it was, you know, a normal kind of small suburb, a normal small parish church. Whereas more attacks further afield, like, you can say, we rarely hear of what's going on in Nigeria at the minute, you know, with the slaughter of Christians and Catholics there. Those things are kind of not mentioned as much. And I think that's something which doesn't inspire the same amount of shock. People do have a solidarity about it. The response is there, but it's not as strong a feeling as it would be something closer to home.
Do you think if the UK took the implementation of freedom of religion and belief more seriously in the domestic sphere, that it would help the UK and charities within the UK champion freedom of religion and belief around the world?
I think so. I think what we have to do is we have to get our house in order. You know, obviously there's varying nations across the UK, and we've had a history of, you know, religious conflict in our own country ourselves. You know, thinking about Northern Ireland and Ireland. So we have to, if we're going to lead the world and talk to other countries about their, you know, freedom of religion and freedom of beliefs, we have to first of all get our own house in order, and that requires everything we've discussed. You know, allowing, you know, the faith to be passed on, less interference from the state on these matters, and great respect for different religious views.
And one question that I ask everyone is, what would be the one thing that you would do to improve freedom of religion or belief in the UK?
One thing I would do to improve freedom of religion in the UK, there's a lot of things you could do. It's hard to kind of pinpoint it down in one specific area. I think in the Catholic context, greater catechesis of what we actually believe is really important. You see constantly the media having this certain portrayal of the Catholic faith in a very negative light. You know, it's almost one issue thing. You know, the abortion thing or the homosexuality thing, and I think wider catechesis of sharing these views in the context of what the faith teaches would make people appreciate that what we do believe and what we do teach is part of a wider belief of loving God and loving thy neighbour. And I think then when you see them in that context, there'll be less opportunity and less suspicion and abuse of the Catholic people.
And because you said that there were other things, I'm going to just ask, what would those other things be?
Well, I think we need to see more representation in the media as well, not just the catechesis in the media, but also framing religious people as normal. what I try and do in Sancta Familia is present the everyday Catholic life stories that are there, and show them as being, these are normal Catholics. These are, there's a successful athlete, successful singer, successful teacher, successful parent, that they're doing the Catholic thing, they're living the Catholic life, they're normal, they're happy, they're contributing to society. I think very often the media has stereotypes about Catholic figures, and actually, this is actually giving me an aside, a kind of idea to ask people on the street who they think of when they think of a Catholic, aside from the Pope or whoever else it is. Interesting.
What's the usual answers?
I haven't tried it yet, but we'll find out.
Yeah, no, that'll be interesting to hear what those answers are. One thing that was mentioned in the previous interview is the hate crime bill, hate crime act now, and the concerns that people have around that particular act on freedom of speech and how that would impact freedom of religion or belief. With Sancta Familia being online and being very active in that sphere, do you have any concerns about that bill in the field of freedom of religion or belief?
I mean, yeah, the back of your mind, you always have that concern that will something that I hold dear and I believe is the benefit of everyone, and I do so in a loving way, could somehow be framed by this bill as an act of hate or something which is criminal. That is always at the back of my mind when we make posts. Obviously, we post everything in line with the Catholic Church's faith. We share that faith. We are Catholics. So we would have recourse to the church. Hopefully, they would back us up, in that teaching. Not all fellow Catholics would. They have divergent views, a lot of them. But we would hope that they would realise that what we are doing and what we continue to do and have done is done with love and done for the betterment of a fellow man.
Well, that's very interesting, and yeah, there's that motivation of trying to promote the common good, I think is very important, and I don't think you can associate hate to that at all. But it'll be interesting to see how the act is actually implemented, and if the concerns do come out to be true, or if they don't. So it'll be interesting in the few months and years ahead. The final question I've just got to ask is, what have Sancta Familia got planned in the months ahead?
Well, actually, fortunately, we've got a very, very busy year ahead in terms of our work schedule. We've got a major project at Caravan with the centenary of the grotto, which has always been, a great focus and a great magnet for the Catholics of Scotland. Interestingly, you should look up the act which came from Caravan, the Act of Government, I think, in 1924, where there was a ban on the Eucharistic processions, which was overturned. It might be something your agency might want to explore, and we might be drawing upon that in this year, looking back on the history of it. But yeah, there's big events marking the 100 years of the grotto, and there'll be a few unveilings of statues. There'll be a visit of relics of St. Bernadette. There'll be hopefully a procession of the Eucharist on Corpus Christi Sunday. Again, that's not been formalised yet, but that's something we're hoping to do. So there is a lot to be done this year, and we're really looking forward to it. And we look to seeing a lot more people from Scotland and beyond coming to the National Shrine.
Oh, that sounds very exciting. And you mentioned Caravan, so I'm going to ask a sneaky last question. There was vandalism at the grotto last year. Do you think that is a reflection of any Catholic or anti-Catholic feeling in Scotland that still exists?
Yeah, I think so. I think the feeling at Caravan was it was a matter of when, not if, and the fact that it happened was sad, but it wasn't, in a sense, totally unexpected, because we've got this huge open area which is rather large, and there's lots of shrines and darker areas of it, which, because of the expanse of it, is very difficult and costly to try and cover it all, lighting and security. some areas are exposed to that, and have been cases in the past, in Scotland during the dark old days of real sectarian strife, during the height of the Troubles, that there were some particularly more aggressive acts of vandalism. So, yeah, but in light of the context of recent, the underbelly of sectarian attacks in churches, there is a feeling that these attacks would happen indiscriminately on the place of worship. And more callous, in fact, was the fact that these were not just a shrine at the church, it was a shrine, a memorial to the people who passed away. So it really betrayed the memory and besmirched the dignity of those people who were immortalized there in that cave.
Yeah, it's shocking that these attacks still happen in the 21st century, and hopefully it's the last one that we hear of. But it's worrying that you are saying that the attitude is, when is it going to happen, rather than is this going to happen? So yeah, that's not the most cheery note to end, but thank you so much for your time this evening, and yes, good luck with everything with Sancta Familia in the year ahead. It sounds like a very busy year that you've got planned, and yeah, I'd be very interested to hear the document that you mentioned from 1924 about overturning the ban on Eucharistic processions, because I think that links very nicely into the field of freedom of religion or belief. And yes, I hope that you also continue to grow on all the social media platforms. I'll put the links at the bottom of the video so everyone who watches can get access.
Perfect. Thank you very much, James, and God bless the work you're doing and fighting for freedom for faith.
Thank you.